Now I want to jump into our event for today. I am really thrilled to have Zeyad Nabolsy with us here today. We are going to be discussing Zeyad's book, Palan Huntunji and the Science Question in Africa, which was just published by Springer Nature. And I really admire Zeyad's work. I try to read everything he publishes, and I was really thrilled to read this new book. I think it's a very important book that makes key interventions into debates about the history of modern science, colonialism, and epistemic difference. Zeyad is an assistant professor of philosophy at York University, where he specializes in the history of Africana philosophy with a focus on modern African philosophy. He is a remarkably prolific scholar with a really impressive and wide-ranging publication record. He has published excellent articles on African Marxism, including on Amilcar Cabral's Philosophy of Culture. He has published about anti-colonial literature in Africa and Asia, the place of women's liberation in anti-colonial struggles in West Africa, ancient 18th and 19th century European philosophy, ancient Egyptian philosophy, and methodological debates about racism and ideology in the historiography of philosophy. And he is currently working on a comparative intellectual history of 19th century African philosophy. Now, one of the many things that I admire about Zeyad's work is the clarity and pedagogical quality of his writing and his ability to explain complex debates to non-specialists, and I think most importantly to show what is really ultimately at stake in these debates. I think this new book on Huntunji and the Science Question in Africa very clearly explains Huntunji's contributions to debates about the history of modern science on the African continent and the effects of colonialism on scientific development there. It explains the importance of historical materialism to Huntunji's work, and very importantly, it demonstrates why historical materialism offers the best framework for understanding how the production and circulation of knowledge is socially determined without falling into the epistemic relativism that clouds so much contemporary theory. So Zeyad, to get us started, please tell us briefly about your overall intellectual trajectory and why you wrote this book on Palan Huntunji and how it fits within the broader trajectory of your research and writing.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this very generous introduction and for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. So in terms of my trajectory, so interestingly enough, I mean, I started out as a chemical engineer, so my undergraduate degree is in chemical engineering, and I had an interest in philosophy, obviously, but it was not, formal or academic in a formal sense. Until I decided to do a master's in philosophy, and I was as somebody who was interested in Marx and so on, as a lot of people do, I decided that I'll work on Hegel, right? Many people come to Hegel through that path, I think. And so I was really interested, especially in Hegel's contributions to debates about the nature of the history of philosophy. I mean, Hegel is basically, partially, responsible for making the history of philosophy a kind of recognized a subfield of academic philosophy in the German Research University and so on. So of course this has already, some of the questions about the relationship between philosophical discourse and its social context come up in that, in relation to Hegel. And I mean, it's interesting, I'll mention this because, of course, Hegel is not a materialist, but Hegel does understand that, in some cases, the social context is very important for the articulation of philosophical discourse. So, for example, when he talks about Stoicism, he thinks you can't really understand Stoic philosophy without understanding the structure of the Roman Empire and so on. I mean, we don't need to go into the details, but already there is a thread there. And then I decided to do my PhD, again, initially on Hegel, but then I developed this interest in African philosophy. So I switched over to Africana studies to work with an African philosopher at Cornell, Olufemi Taiwo. And so with respect to Palan Huntunji, I was very interested in the way he approached questions about African philosophy, because one of the distinctive things, I guess, about African philosophy is that meta-philosophical questions have always been important for African philosophy as an academic discourse, because there was always this debate about whether African philosophy exists, if so, what is its nature, and so on. And also, of course, the question of the relationship between philosophy and politics. How autonomous can philosophy be? How autonomous ought philosophy to be? Especially because, of course, if you look at the historical context, many people would date kind of, formal academic African philosophy to the 1960s, 1950s, and this is, of course, the period where you have all of these independence projects. So there is a question of that's being posed to a lot of African philosophers. Well, look, we have limited resources as these newly independent states, and of course, the higher education sector was, almost entirely underdeveloped in many African countries on the eve of independence. So there was always this question of what does philosophy have to say about pressing issues such as development? And I think you see that very clearly in Anton G. Even if he's not explicit about the program, you see it, I think, all the way through in his writings. Even when he's writing about Edmund Husserl's theory of science and so on, I think this is always in the background. So it was a very kind of engaged approach to philosophy that I found quite interesting. And also, very much neglected. I mean, insofar as people talk about Anton G, most of the time people talk about him as just a critic of ethnophilosophy. So if you've ever encountered him, it would be as a critic of ethnophilosophy. And also, people accuse him of being very naive about social structures and so on, because I think they have this image that he just has this Husserlian critique of ethnophilosophy. And I think I showed in the book it's totally false that he's not engaged with social realities or theories of imperialism. And I think in part it's because of his writings on scientific dependency, which really are, they date from later on in his career, 1980s, 1990s, whereas the ethnophilosophy stuff dates from the 60s, culminating in his book in the mid-70s on African philosophy. So I guess what I wish to do was to show that there is a very, I think, fruitful historical materialist approach to these questions in African philosophy.
Thank you. So I'd like you to discuss Hontunji's important critique of ethnophilosophy, which you've mentioned, which is, I think, of a part with the critique of culturalism found in the work of Samir Min and many other Marxists, as well as Olufemi Taiwo's critique of the metaphysics of difference. And what are the key philosophical errors found in these essentializing treatments of culture, and of African culture in particular? And how do these philosophical errors also produce errors in political strategy?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. I mean, maybe the best way to start is to say why people would have found ethnophilosophy appealing in the first place. So usually, the kind of formal discourse on ethnophilosophy is usually dated to the publication of Placide Tempels' book Bantu Philosophy, 1945. So it's written in Flemish, translated into French, and then it's translated from French into English. So actually there are lots of debates about, whether he's being misrepresented. We'll set that aside. But so Placide Tempels was, writing in a period where people denied the existence of African philosophy. So here then was this Belgian missionary who was working in the Congo, in the south central region of the Congo, amongst the Luba people. And he comes and says, no, these people, they do have a philosophical system. And it's a coherent philosophical system. And once you really understand the system, you understand that there is a kind of rationality that animates their discourse, their practices. So people found the ethnophilosophical discourse appealing because it was set against a claim that Africans don't even have philosophy. And of course, this is associated with racist discourse on Africans, maybe even in the Francophone context with some of the work of Lévi-Brul in the 1910s and 20s, where he's talking about a pre-logical mentality and so on. So the people around, for example, the circle of Présence Africaine here in Paris, they celebrate the book. They say this is fantastic. I mean, this is great. This guy shows that there is an African philosophy. But and Senghor, Leopold Senghor, who later on becomes first president of Senegal, he has this celebratory discourse about the book, and actually the Présence Africaine was also was a journal, and then they developed a kind of publishing house, and the first book they published was Placide Tempels. They republished it in 1949. So that kind of sets up also how dangerous it was to take on ethno-philosophy critically, because it was seen as an emancipatory project, right? But okay, so what are the main issues with ethno-philosophy? What does
Zeyad, to frame that, could you just give a definition of ethno-philosophy in case people are having trouble with that?
Yeah. Right. So I think that ethno-philosophy is a kind of it's an exonym in the sense that people who do ethno-philosophy did not use that label themselves. It was used in a kind of pejorative way to describe them, and the connection here was between this kind of philosophical discourse and a more established way of studying the sciences of indigenous people. So people used to talk about ethnosciences. So temporally, ethnosciences precede ethnophilosophy. So people would go and say, especially Europeans, explorers or missionaries, they would write texts, for example, describing the botanical knowledge of a certain group of people, and this would be an ethnobotanical text that they would produce. And of course, you have ethnomathematics and so on. So ethnophilosophy is a way to talk about how people had this kind of ethnographic approach to talking about philosophy amongst certain peoples. And really, I think the key issue with ethnophilosophy is that you see it, for example, very clearly in Placide Tempels' text, where there is an assumption that there is a unanimity amongst those people. So Placide Tempels says, look, basically, all people who speak Bantu languages have these beliefs. So what are the beliefs? I mean, it doesn't matter so much for our purposes, but just for the record, the belief he thinks is essentially these people, they identify being with force. So they have this dynamic ontology, and they think that there is a hierarchy of forces, and this explains observable phenomena. Basically, that's kind of the view. But of course, you can see there is a shift happening here, because one key issue is if you look at how people have studied, for example, or presented the history of philosophy in Europe, the assumption of unanimity is totally incongruent with our understanding of philosophy, because philosophy in part is about arguments, it is about objections, responses to those objections. So if I come and say, look, here is a society where everybody basically agrees with everyone else, this seems very suspicious. I mean, what kind of philosophical discourse is going on there? And in addition, and here we related to the question of the social structure, I think in part the assumption was these are sufficiently simple and undifferentiated societies that fundamental disagreements wouldn't arise. So it has a kind of association or elective affinity with the discourse of primitive savagery. I think this is a key issue. And the other issue too is many of the texts that were presented as examples in this ethno-philosophical discourse were really mythological accounts. So these were accounts that did not present themselves as philosophical discourses. So now the question is, if I'm the ethno-philosopher and I say, look, here is the creation account of this group of people, I'm going to tell you what are the underlying metaphysical assumptions and so on. Well, the issue here is that there is a kind of underdetermination problem. The textual evidence, so let's say you speak to elders who are repositories of knowledge in that community, you get a transcript, you compare transcripts and so on, but let's say you have a text, but the text itself is not explicit at all, it's underdetermined. So there is a question of, are you kind of foisting your own beliefs onto these people? And I think this is closely related to the question of responsibility and disagreement, because if I tell you this is Iroquois philosophy, for instance, it's very hard to understand how me as this, single individual will go argue with the Iroquois people. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. Who am I going to argue with? Who am I going to raise objections to? And I think another, aspect of ethnophilosophy, which you still see it, I think, today, you know, when people talk about this stuff, is that there is this idea that these claims, because they are made by, you know, marginalized peoples, or, you know, in this case, colonized peoples, of course, in Placide Temples' case, that we shouldn't really be in a position where we're trying to assess their truth value. What we're doing is we're describing them, and we're not really engaging with them. And Hontonji would say, well, actually, this is not, you know, this might seem like a gesture of generosity, but it's really a lack of respect. You know, I'm not taking you as an epistemic peer, somebody who I could disagree with and raise objections to. You know, it's almost paternalistic. It's, you know, it's very impressive that you have a philosophy or something like that, and we leave it at that. So I think these are some of the issues. But I think I want to, you know, just say one more thing about this, because one of the things that Paulin Hontonji points out when he talks about ethnophilosophy, and I think it's really crucial to his criticism of it, is he says this is an extroverted discourse. So what does he mean by that? So he says it's a discourse that's directed towards a non-African audience. He says it's a discourse that's put on to please another in order to kind of meet a certain expectation that European readers have of Africans. And I just have this quotation, maybe I can read it because I think it's really helpful. He connects extroversion to the overemphasis on originality. So you'll see a lot of the time there's a question of, is this uniquely African? And of course, the uniqueness or originality question is interesting, but of course one more basic question is, well, is this even correct? You know, regardless of whether this is unique or original, is this adequate, right? So I'm just going to read this. This is from his most famous book, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality. So the quest for originality is always bound up with a desire to show off. It has meaning only in relation to the other, from whom one wishes to distinguish oneself at all costs. This is an ambiguous relationship, and as much as the assertion of one's difference goes hand in hand with a passionate urge to have it recognized by that same other. So it creates a kind of pathological situation where on the one hand you want to assert that you're different from this other, you know, and to make it more concrete here, he's talking about a metropolitan audience, usually in the former colonizing country, right? So if he's talking here about, you know, Francophone African philosophy, he's talking about the fact that it's addressed to a French audience in the metropole. So on the one hand, you want to assert your difference, but you also want to have this difference recognized by the other, so you always give this other power over you. So it's, you know, it's a kind of pathological situation. So, and finally, to get to the last part of the question, sorry, this was a long-winded answer, but, you know, in terms of the political stakes, I think it's important to note that, you know, assertions of cultural difference or cultural authenticity are used and have historically been used to defend very regressive policies, whether, you know, that be at the geopolitical level in terms of alignments, or at the internal social level. And to give you an example, and I think, you know, this is an example that's important for Hontonji himself, because he went to teach in Congo. And of course, Mobutu was in power at that time in the early 70s, and Mobutu had this kind of discourse of authenticity, and he would show up, you know, to public events wearing leopard skins and so on. You know, you can find it on YouTube, right? But along with this kind of discourse of authenticity came a very pro-Western geopolitical stance. So Mobutu supported US interventions in Angola, and he established trade ties with apartheid South Africa. So here, you know, the level of struggle, or, you know, the level of assertion of difference wasn't being had at the geopolitical, economic, or political level, but rather at the cultural level. And I think this worry, I think, is still relevant, I think, to some of what's happening today.
I think that's an excellent example. And for Monday, we're going to be reading, discussing Samir Amin's essay on culturalism as a weapon of imperialism, which I think gets directly to this issue. So You mentioned how you think that these, ethno-philosophical paradigms, we still see them. So I wanted to ask you, where do you see some of these type of approaches manifesting themselves in contemporary theory, and what social and historical factors help to explain the tenacity of these ethno-philosophical or culturalist paradigms?
Thank you. I mean, it's hard not to just name names, or so I won't do a list or something. But I think kind of if we're talking about contemporary discourse, I think you see it pop up a lot in what's called decolonial theory or decolonial discourse. So you have people talking about the West versus the non-West. And here actually what's interesting is that the ethno-philosophical approach is being universalized. So there is kind of one Western philosophy. So you'll see people, for example, talking about Cartesian dualism as a marker of Western philosophy, which is very odd, of course, because there were lots of disagreements over this issue, and it's not obvious to me at all that this ever became hegemonic. So there is a kind of universalization of the discourse of ethno-philosophy. We have these people who have this cultural ethos, which is expressed in this philosophical orientation. We have another people opposed to them who have another ethos, which is expressed in another philosophical orientation. And very similarly, you see something like that happening in Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, so maybe we can get to that later, but basically the entire idea in Robinson's Black Marxism is that there is a kind of trans-historical Western civilization which expresses itself regardless of these transformations at the social and economic level. Its intellectual core is the same. Likewise, there is a kind of African ethos which gets transplanted into the New World, of course, due to the cross-Atlantic slave trade, which again is basically an expression of a philosophy that's basically held by all Africans. And just to connect it, I mean, very briefly, if you look at the only serious footnotes about African philosophy in Black Marxism, it's a reference to John Mbete's book, 1970 book, African Religions and Philosophy, which is, I think, an exemplar of the ethno-philosophical approach in Anglophone African philosophy literature. But, we don't need to go into the details there. And you also, I think, see it in general in this idea that, and maybe here I'm maybe projecting, my particular experiences with North American academia, but you see it, in this idea that if only we had a mechanism to recognize differences appropriately, this would basically be a solution to political problems. I think a lot of North American academic discourse tends to take on this assumption. And of course, representation is important, but I think it's not enough to change the world in the way we should want to change the world. I think this is, I think this should be clear. But I think on a more macro level, I think this discourse, this culturalist discourse, looking at it maybe from a more macro level, I think it's basically, and Hontonji has a really interesting analysis of it. He says, look, you have to understand that this is really the philosophical discourse that's best suited to a very weak post-colonial petty bourgeoisie that's unable really to take on these independence projects, take on the mantle of these independent projects at the political and economic level. So it finds that the easiest way to assert itself is through making everything essentially revolve around culture, because you can talk about culture all the time. It's not a big deal, and say you're defending traditional culture and so on. I think he has this, Antonji has this kind of ideology critique of ethnophilosophy, which operates at two levels, right? So it shows that this discourse is just inadequate as a philosophical discourse for the reasons that we just talked about, and then it tries to explain, well, look, if this is this kind of discourse is so inadequate, and if it doesn't accord with the evidence at all, then why is it that so many people adhere to it? And then that's where the social functional explanation comes in, to say that actually it functions to buttress or support the power of the petty bourgeoisie in these African colonies. So I think it's a classic example of Marxist ideology critique. You show that the belief is false, it doesn't match the evidence at all, and then you explain why it's being held despite the fact that it's obviously false. So I think really we can connect what Hontonji is doing to more traditional Marxist ideology critique.
No, and it brings to my mind the kind of critique that you see from people like Adolf Reed Jr., who talk about kind of race essentialist ideologies being a particular expression of like a PMC within the imperial core.
Right.
So it's as a kind of analog to what you're talking about. I think those are all really, really important points. And I know you did just author an excellent critique of Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, so if we have time, we'll definitely get into that. But I do want to ask you next about the aspect of your book and your analysis of Hontonji's work. You counter the claim that modern science is intrinsically Western or colonial. And in contrast to this view, can you explain to us what does he teach us about the relationship between modern science and colonialism on one hand, and between modern science and endogenous knowledge on the other?
Yeah, so that's a very big question. So I'll try to kind of hone in. I think one good starting point would be to understand why I wanted to talk about modern science as opposed to Western science in the book. So I go in a bit of detail trying to explain the differences. And so to start, so from Hontonji's perspective, he has this, this is the standard view, right? Of course, there are revisionist accounts and so on, so this complicates the story, but the standard view is that something special happened in Europe in the early modern period. So if people talk about the scientific revolution, they're usually dating it from the 16th or 17th century, depending on how you see things. But Hontonji, really for him, the paradigmatic, kind of modern science is Galilean science. And why is that? Because he thinks that it's really there that you get this notion that you can and ought to attempt to develop mathematical descriptions of structures in nature. And then the other pillar of early modern scientific discourse that Hontonji makes a big deal of, which makes sense given that he's a Marxist, is the emphasis on experimentation, actual intervention in the world. And of course, there is a lot of Marxist literature in history and philosophy of science talking about science as a kind of labor process, so if you emphasize the experimentation aspect, you can see where this would fit in. And so Hontonji actually buys the claim that, look, early modern science developed in Europe. We don't know of any other society in human history that developed anything like that. And he says this is basically correct. But then the question he wants to say is, okay, we assume that this is correct. How does that make modern science essentially Western? What does that really mean if somebody says that modern science is essentially, in some essential sense, yet to be specified Western? And here I have a quote from him. Maybe I can read it as well, just to give a flavor of what he's saying here. It should be noted the fact that Galileo is Italian or a European or a Western doesn't matter much except for the ideologues of Western imaginary superiority. So I think, one of the things he wants to say is that, of course, you can say that early modern science developed uniquely in Europe, but this is not because Europeans were much more intelligent than everyone else or biologically superior to everyone else. He actually ties it, of course, with the development of capitalism in early modern Europe. So, then of course there is a debate about whether capitalism developed elsewhere. Hontonji doesn't think that's true. He thinks it first developed in Europe. Anyway, but Hontonji also wants to say, look, you have to understand that cultures are a product of their interactions with one another. So even when we're talking about a European development, that society itself was shaped by its interaction with other societies, as is normal, So he says, this idea that, you just have the Western isolation from the rest of the world involves a narrow vision of history that doesn't really take into account interactions between different societies. So I think Hontonji would say something like this, and I try to go into more detail in the book. So I think with respect to the relationship the historical relationship between modern science and endogenous knowledge, I think there is a strong claim and a weak claim. So the strong claim goes something like this, and I think he rejects this, and I think we ought to reject it. So the strong claim is something like this. that the key theoretical advances in early modern science involved the appropriation of concepts that were first articulated in indigenous or endogenous knowledge systems in non-European societies. So that's the strong claim. This would be the kind of stolen legacy argument. You see it again in circulation at the academic level, but also maybe in social media sometimes. You know, I'm on Twitter all the time, so this messes with my head in terms of gauging what people are talking about. But you see something like that. I mean, I think this stolen legacy argument, I think it's totally unsupported by the evidence. That would be my view. I think there is really no evidence to show that. But I think there is a weaker version of it that I think Hontonji subscribes to, and I think that one is supported by the evidence. So the weaker version goes something like this. So some of the elements which were, relevant causally in terms of bringing about the early modern scientific revolution came about as a result of the contact between Europeans and non-Europeans. So I think a great example of that would be gunpowder. So if you think about the three great inventions that Francis Bacon thinks, reshaped the world, of course he's talking about gunpowder, the compass, and the printing press. And why are those inventions important? It's because those inventions really make it possible to say that the moderns, so in early modern Europe there was the debate about the moderns or the ancients. So in the Renaissance, of course, the Renaissance involved a kind of holding up of classical learning as the peak of learning, right? So that Renaissance philosophers would talk about the importance of going back to Plato, rereading Plato in the original Greek and so on. But over the 17th century and 18th century, there comes to be the view that actually no, especially in the realm of the sciences, the moderns have far surpassed the ancients. So you have this kind of break. And one of the supporting bits of evidence that they produce is a reference to these inventions. So that Francis Bacon refers to the printing press, gunpowder, and the compass. Well, what's really interesting is actually two of those inventions, at least two of them, are of Chinese provenance, right? So the gunpowder and the compass, so makes its way to Europe through Arab mariners in the Mediterranean and so on. So you can see actually here a key element in breaking the hold of the ancients over the moderns in Europe had to do precisely with this interaction between Europe and the rest of the world. So we can have a very concrete example, I think, of how this weaker version would go. But I think this has nothing to do with saying that, the kind of conceptual innovations, this mathematization of, or attempt to mathematize all phenomena which characterized the early modern scientific revolution, that this was, directly imported by Europeans from other peoples. I think there is just no evidence to support that. Sorry, and I think I'll just add something really briefly on that. I mean, the other thing is to say, look, modern science is not equivalent to Western science in the sense that there is an important discontinuity in the history of science in Europe, because if you look, for example, at Aristotelian physics was not a quantitative science, it was a qualitative science. So if you're going to talk about something like Western science, you have to really understand that there are these very important discontinuities. And actually, in one sense, you could say that Greek science was basically just another form of pre-modern science, insofar as it had this qualitative emphasis, and it was non-mathematical in character. So there is something distinctive about the modern aspect of modern science that isn't reducible to just, the ethos of the West expressing itself, really. That's what I would say. And the last thing I would say on that is, on the question of ownership, I think Hontonji is very helpful here, because he wants to say, look, when people say, well, people talk about owning ideas in a metaphorical sense, it's hard to say, well, actually, what does it mean to say you own modern science or modern physics or something? But I think one way to think about it that makes it coherent is to talk about mastery. So if you master a kind of science or a kind of conceptual framework, it doesn't really matter who developed it. And we have, the history of algebra, for example, as an, so algebra, key conceptual developments in algebra happened in Central Asia and so on, but you wouldn't say that, you know, Central Asian Muslims own algebra. I mean, this is absurd. Everybody would recognize that this is absurd. So I think something similar here would be adequate. I'm going to stop here because that was a very long rant.
No, thank you. That was great. So now I want to ask you, how can we understand science in a universalist sense, and what is the value of doing so? Marxism insists on the social determination of epistemic activity, yet, as you make very clear in this book, this is very different from epistemic relativism. So could you please differentiate these approaches for us?
Thank you. Yeah, again, that's a really big question. So yeah, we could talk a lot about this. But I think, you know, one key thing to note is that on the Marxist view of the role of social determination in the production of knowledge claims and so on, I think the key point to note is that, at least as I interpret the Marxist or historical materialist approach, is that what we're really saying is that not all forms of social determination skew knowledge claims away from the truth. What we're really saying is that we're the kind of, you know, animals, because of our, you know, whatever evolutionary history and so on, that need a kind of social scaffolding to come to know nature. And so certain forms of social scaffolding will help you know nature in a better way than other forms of social scaffolding. But to say that there is a kind of social scaffolding and we don't have direct access to nature, therefore all of our attempts to know nature or grasp nature are inadequate, I think that's not really part of the standard, I think, historical materialist take on the question of social determination. And I think, you know, on the question of relativism, I mean, and here I think, you know, we could say that there is also a kind of, at least as I interpret it, of course, all of these things are open to debate, so this is my own take on this. Happy, of course, to go into a debate on this. But I think there is a really important naturalist component in Marxism that says, look, fundamentally, we're animals. Because of our evolutionary history, we ended up being rational animals, but we are the kinds of animals that need to cooperate. We have to, and therefore we have to solve these coordination problems in order to survive. And so, in that sense, actually, our standards of adequate justification, what would count as epistemic standards, basically, is tied to what would make these cooperative endeavors successful, right? So you could say, well, look, you know, maybe something like consistency or coherence with the evidence, I want to say this is some culturally relative epistemic standard. I don't want to adhere to this. And that's fine, you could say that. But once you're engaged in practical collective endeavors, you're going to find out very quickly that this is a serious obstacle. The fact that you're not taking this rule or the standard seriously is a very serious obstacle to practical success. So I think we can connect it to understanding ourselves as, you know, embodied animals who are living social lives and so on. And now, you know, so this is all pretty abstract, but I think on a fundamental level, if we take, I think, the historical experience of contact between many, I mean, I'm not going to say all because of course I haven't studied all, but many non-European societies and modern European technology and science, for example, in the 19th century, you can see very clearly that because this modern scientific discourse was being harnessed to manipulate nature in a certain way, that one couldn't be skeptical about it. I mean, you could be skeptical if I present you, for example, you know, some theory of mechanics, some account of ballistics, but you cannot be skeptical if, you know, I use my navy to bombard your city. What are you going to be skeptical about? Just see the royal palace burn or something, right? So I think this kind of interventionist aspect, I think, is really important, this interventionist understanding of the relationship between humans and nature and how we come to know whether our theories of nature are adequate or not, because we tie it back to practical activity. I mean, the story is a bit more complicated than that. But the other thing I would say is that, you know, the historical record, to me at least, seems to indicate that we have a lot of shared notions. And it's not true, I think, that, you know, we have these hermetically sealed cultures that can't really communicate with one another. And you see that, in instances of borrowing, whether at the level of borrowing ideas, if we just reference the history of algebra, but also even borrowing technologies. So it seems that across societies, for example, I can have a notion of the efficiency of a cutting tool, so that if you show me a really sharp steel knife, I recognize that this is a more efficient way of cutting than, maybe an obsidian blade. I mean, I don't know if this is true, but this is just something I just as an example, could be the opposite. So I think there is a very important difference between some of these relativistic approaches and the historical materialist approach, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you. And why do you think the view that equates modern science, or even modernity per se, with the West or with colonialism has had such purchase in academic circles? Do you think that this responds to, reflects particular ideologies? And related to that, what do you make of the claim that modernity itself is Western, or that there are alternative modernities?
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna start with the last part of the question first. So I think, if by modernity is Western, we just mean that, some of its key markers first emerged in this part of the world. I mean, I think this is correct. But if we mean that this is an expression of a trans-historical kind of ethos or spirit of the West, then I think this is just totally false. Or if it means that only Europeans can, master some of the principles associated with this, if we're talking about kind of, the philosophical discourse of modernity in Habermas's sense, again, I think this is totally misleading and false. I mean, as for alternative modernities, if it means that, of course, there are aspects of attempts to modernize that have to do with, the specific histories of societies, and then that must be reflected in this modernization project for it to be feasible. I think this is just correct again, right? So this is not really a good answer, but it's one of those, Aristotle would give all of these answers, yes insofar as X, no insofar as Y. So this is this kind of answer. A hand wavy answer, but I would, so I would qualify this claim and, answer it accordingly. I mean, I think with respect to why it's so popular, I mean, it strikes me that sometimes there is just some kind of concession that actually only Europeans and those who are descendant from European colonists can really master science. Actually, there is sometimes this assumption that's being made by those who want to show that, maybe modern science is intrinsically colonial, or it has some affinity with domination. Again, I think this is basically to concede to the racist discourse, right? But then presenting it as some kind of emancipatory move that one makes. Whereas I think, if you look at, for example, China. So China is a really good case, and I was there recently, and we were talking about this. So of course, you cannot say that the Chinese have been unable to assimilate modern science. This has just been proven to be false. And of course, they have a certain attitude towards certain endogenous scientific discourses. But again, it's all tied to, I think, successful testing and seeing whether these claims are adequate or not, and not just taking them for granted because they are traditional or something like that. So I think China has a really it's a really interesting case for these kinds of debates. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but that would be something for future work. I would look into that. But also, I think, it's also the way I see it, the way people talk about science and the West and Eurocentrism, I think in part it has to do with the confusion about what Eurocentrism is. Well, what's the problem with Eurocentrism? So if you go back to, the text that popularized the term Eurocentrism, so Samir Amin's book Eurocentrism popularized it. Samir Amin actually doesn't think that Eurocentrism happens for the most part at the level of claims about priority. So for example, Samir Amin doesn't think that it's false that capitalism first developed in European social formations. But he thinks the Eurocentrism happens at the level of explanation, at the level of etiology. When you try to explain this by referring to, in the 19th century, it would be some, biological race science explanation. In the 20th century, we maybe have more culturalist Weberian explanations. So actually, in that paradigmatic critique of Eurocentrism, the debate is at the level of explanation. So I think, some people seem to think that just if I say that in terms of temporal priority, X first emerged in Western Europe, then I'm being Eurocentric. I mean, of course, if I'm wrong, then I'm being wrong, and that's that. But I think we have to be a bit careful, right, about what exactly we think is Eurocentric or not. And it strikes me also that in general, this equation between, coloniality and science and so on is a kind of discourse of defeat, really. And to bring it back to Hontonji's context, I think Hontonji's writings embody this kind of optimistic spirit of the 1960s on the African continent, where actually people thought, look, if we play our hand right, we might be able to catch up, we might be able to develop our own scientific institutions and so on, we might be able to end scientific and technological dependency on the West. But it's interesting that, of course, by the 1980s, this is basically a dead project. So this kind of, these Bandung era developmental projects have been abandoned. You have structural adjustment is on the agenda, and actually what it does is basically it erodes the economic basis for any possibility of developing a kind of autonomous scientific discourse in many parts of the African continent. And interestingly enough, it's in the 1980s and 1990s where you start seeing, this kind of discourse about this relativist discourse about science and so on becoming quite popular. So I think functionally we have to try to relate these two elements and see is this really just a concession to a defeat and trying to redescribe it as some kind of victory.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll ask you one last question, kind of maybe combining two of my questions, and then we can open up. But you explain how Hontonji offers a historical materialist account of dependency in Africa regarding scientific knowledge. So I wanted to ask you both, how does he understand the relationship between imperialism and the production of scientific knowledge? And also, why is it important that this, he's using dependency theory as a starting point for this analysis of the relationship between science and development, as opposed to grounding it in non-Marxist or Western Marxist paradigms?
Yeah, that's. I think that's a really important question because it goes really, I think, to the core of the book. And so I think it's, so Hontonji, so he picks up one, I think, historical materialist approach to science, which is attributable to the Russian physicist and philosopher and historian of science, Boris Hassan. So Hassan had a very famous paper on Newton, trying to kind of relate Newton's work to the socio-historical context. So this paper, I think it dates from 1931, if I'm not mistaken. And basically Hassan's key claim is to say, look, the reason that early modern science was able to pick up is because it was able to study technology that was developed to further economic progress. So he ties actually theoretical scientific breakthroughs to the study of existing technology. And he ties that technological development to the rise of the bourgeoisie in England in the early modern period. And importantly, he doesn't say that early modern science developed to serve capitalism. He thinks that's not true, but he thinks it couldn't have developed without the release of fetters on the development of technology that capitalism allowed for. And so you could say this is quite interesting, but what does this have to do with the colonial context? And I think this is where the dependency theory comes in. And I think Hontonji would think about it as follows. He would try to understand what did colonialism do to social formations on the African continent. And his claim would be that actually it did not have the, it didn't induce the kind of dynamism that we saw with capitalism in Europe, and in fact it kind of placed fetters on technological development. And in the book I have a discussion of various examples of deindustrialization under colonialism on the African continent, and then trying to tie it back to the possibility of developing a modern scientific discourse through the Hassan account. So I think that's I think where you get something quite different from people who look at the history of science, primarily looking at it in the European context through the Hassan framework, without taking into account the colonial framework. And this is where I think ontology is quite different and doing something that I take to be quite interesting. So this is why I think that the dependency theory part is really important. And in the book I have it, basically the key argument would be, to put it in very brief terms, would be you have a premise that comes from Boris Hassan, where he basically is trying to show that social forms, he uses the term social forms, that impede technological development are an impediment on the development of science. And then you have a second premise coming from dependency theory, saying that colonialism was a social form that impeded technological development on the African continent. And the conclusion that would follow when you put these two premises together is that colonialism as a social form impeded the development of a modern scientific discourse on the African continent, which, if you notice, is a total inversion of the idea that colonialism involved this civilizing mission on the African continent, at least. And importantly, it actually leads you to look at things differently, circling back to the question about decoloniality and so on. If you read a lot of this stuff, and I mean, there is actually, of course, the complicating factor here is that decolonial theory, its initial paradigmatic exemplars are cases from Latin America, and then gets foisted onto the African context, which is, I think, very different. But anyway, setting aside that issue. But there is this idea that colonialism sought to impose modern science on the colonized. And actually you see it in Western North Africa, at least. The opposite is true. In fact, colonial officials went out of their way to make sure that Africans couldn't get an education in the modern sciences. And I think this is really, these insights are the product of taking this historical materialist approach seriously, to relate it back to your question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So let's go ahead and open this up to questions from the participants.
Yeah, and if you're online, go ahead and use the raise hand function. While Seema's getting the microphone, I might just kick it off, if that's okay, very quickly. With Zeyad, I was curious to hear you on the very category of Europe, because there's so much conversation about Europe with very little analysis of the fact that it's a concept that has its own history, and its delimitation has changed significantly over time. The ancient Greeks didn't think they were the origin of European civilization. This was a modern creation that was retrospectively projected back onto the ancient Greeks. And a lot of the consolidation of the conceptual category of Europe had to do with the colonial project as well in the modern age. But the second question goes more to the heart of matters, because the class analysis that you have behind your critique of ethnophilosophy I think is really important, and I'd love to hear you more on this. In particular, it strikes me that ethnophilosophy or culturalism can often allow the petty bourgeois class segment, if it be the comprador petty bourgeoisie in the periphery or the kind of middle layer within the imperial core, to be class traders in the negative sense, not the positive sense, meaning that they can appear to be cultural ambassadors who are on the side of the people, who identify with a particular ethnicity and often speak for and in the name of them, but that appearance is belied by the substance, meaning the socioeconomic position that they occupy and the type of material relations that they want to preserve. So I'd love to hear you more both on how that plays itself out within the colonial context or within the periphery and semi-periphery, but also within the imperial core, and if culturalism is a principal form of kind of the class trader elements of the petty bourgeoisie that wants to appear on the side of the people while doing the work of the imperial bourgeoisie ultimately. But we can have other questions. Other questions?
Yeah.
Thank you for that discussion. It was really interesting. My question is pretty simple. I'd like to know if you could expand on the idea of social forms. I believe Boris Essen was the name that you mentioned, but specifically how the idea of social form or thinking of colonialism as a social form, as you said, as opposed to, for example, a civilizing mission, which would seem to hang more at the level of the concept. Maybe social form is closer tied to reality, but specifically this idea, I guess how you see it functioning, maybe within your own work, but also just in general as a way of thinking about relationships of domination.
Can I? Yeah. Well,
It's good. Yeah,
it's good.
just go ahead.
Yes. Thank you again for your talk. My question is, yes, a bit, simple. It's about the. I'm just curious about how Tonji speculates much about the African philosophy that he can, if he envisions one, and its relationship to epistemic difference. I was curious about, if how this African philosophy should look like, if it's should avoid kind of epistemic difference in the sense of epistemic difference, at least in the case of ethnophilosophy, is it related to culturalism, but is it at all kind of something viable for a prospect of African philosophy? He thinks like it's more like should aspire like to be a universalist, universal philosophy. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could expand on one portion of your answer to one of Jennifer's questions, which was about why there seems to be a trend within academia where science and modernity is tied to Western culture. And you had answered, you said something like that. It seems to be that science is inherent, or that their answer is that science is inherently colonial because it has something to do with, or they tend to tie it with domination and that it's extractive, right? And so I'm wondering if you could say more about that, because from what I understand, there's this argument that science has this tendency to be it sort of divides up, right? It's sort of like it divides. It attempts to dominate what it's trying to figure out and extract. Usually, I guess it's usually it can't be separated from its context within capitalism, right? And so we might be producing technologies that are for capitalist purposes. If you could expand more about that, and also I wonder if there's a way that we can sort of separate science from its capitalist purposes, and what that would look like. So.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with the last question first. I think of course. So. Approaching this at a very basic level, you could say, well, look, if you're talking about science, it involves abstraction. Abstraction involves, setting aside certain features of what we want to study. It involves model building, so it involves simplification. So in that sense, it involves a kind of distortion, but the other side would be to say that you do need this kind of abstraction to build models, because otherwise these models are not really functional at all, right? I mean, if I give you a super concrete map of Paris that had no abstraction at all, that would be a totally unusable map of Paris if it had, you know, a representation of everything. So I think, you know, it's a tricky issue, right? But the other point about, you know, capitalism, and of course, you know, science is shaped by the fact that it's being undertaken in social formations dominated by capitalism. But at least to some extent, I think, and you know, maybe today this is not so true, but historically, I think even capitalists have understood that science, to be useful for capitalists, it needs to be relatively autonomous, right? If you insisted always on, you know, questions of on demonstrating utility and so on, actually this would halt the development of science at the theoretical level, which would then, you know, have ramifications at the level of application, at the level of commercialization. And that's why it's kind of funny, you know, all of these things about what's it called, like DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, when they went, and no, but you know, it illustrates this point, because they went and saw all of these, you know, NSF funded projects, and they're like, well, why are people funding research about zebrafish and their dietary habits? This is silly, or, you know, their sexual behavior. But actually, I mean, what I think they don't understand is that from a capitalist perspective, the track record shows that you need to give scientists some autonomy. Otherwise, you're actually hindering. So it's in your self-interest to create institutions that are somewhat autonomous. Of course, there are cases where this autonomy doesn't obtain at all. The greatest example of this, of course, is race science, whether it be in its Victorian vein in the 19th century, and of course, you know, Nazi science, Nazi race science, and it's kind of racial hygiene stuff, racial hygiene stuff. So I think it's a really complicated picture, and I wouldn't want to say that the fact that, you know, science is done under capitalism makes it so that it loses all autonomy. And I think, you know, if you look at concrete cases, one excellent example would be climate science, where actually, you know, regardless of the political commitment of individual climate scientists, I mean, there is basically a consensus that a certain model of indefinite growth is just incompatible with survival on this planet, right? And you can draw, of course, political implications from that. You can have a debate about that. But I think that would be a case actually where, you know, the relative autonomy of science is becoming like clear in that case. So there is a lot more to say about this, but I hope that was sort of, you know, a beginning of an answer. And maybe I'll circle back to one of Gabriel's first questions or comments, because I just remembered something really funny and interesting in Hontonji. I mean, it's not funny. It's funny for me if you have, you know, my taste in humor. But, you know, on the question of Europe and, you know, the internal differentiation of Europe. So Hontonji, in his book African Philosophy, he says, you know, look, well, Europe is kind of complex because the same Europe that gave us Lenin is the same one that gave us Hitler. So, you know, what are, you know, it's quite complicated. You can't talk about a homogeneous Europe. And, you know, what I remembered was in the English translation, they removed Lenin and put in Marx, which is really interesting because that translation is being done, I think, in the 1980s. So people want to distance Hontonji from Lenin, even though I think, you know, there is some Leninist element there. But anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up also, because there is no way it's a translation error, right? You can't, you know, mistranslate Lenin as Marx. And so it has to be a political decision, right? Yeah, and so the other question about class analysis and, you know, what, you know, what role or what role does, you know, this culturalism stuff play? I mean, I think if we go back, you know, there is of course this question of people who use a certain kind of culturalist discourse to defend political projects or social projects that aren't in the interest of the working class or the peasantry in the global south. I think that's definitely the case, But the other thing that's really interesting too is that the cultural stuff seems to me also to be a kind of reiteration of left Hegelianism. So it's a kind of anti-Marxist approach, which is to say, even if I don't say, well, look, these people are misdirecting people towards interests that aren't their own objective interests. I think there is an aspect when you overvalue the cultural discourse stuff, where you're essentially saying, actually, no, emancipation can be had just if we get the right ideas, we'll be fine. So actually, we take a step back, I think, and we're back to kind of left Hegelianism, which was, the subject of criticism in the German ideology, of course. So I find it atavistic in that sense as well. And you see it, a lot in North American academia, where people, they have this idea that by presenting their paper, they're also doing political work. I mean, I find this a bit baffling, right? And because I go to these conferences and people are always, trying to show that they're doing political work while also fulfilling their 10-year requirements. It's very problematic, I think, because of course it leads to a kind of facile politicization of intellectual work, right? Where you say, well, actually it has this political upshot and it's kind of grafted on it and it's done very poorly, and then maybe bringing, progressive approaches into disrepute. I mean, at least that's kind of how I feel about some of the stuff. What else? There were lots of questions, so I wrote some stuff down too. Okay, on epistemic difference. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right that ontology, if people, so people sometimes will use, particularists versus universalists as a kind of taxonomic framing in African philosophy, and ontology would be a universalist. I think he wouldn't be hostile, of course, to the idea that African philosophy, as it develops, because it's responding to a particular context and so on, will just look differently from academic philosophy that develops elsewhere. So I think he wouldn't be hostile to that. But I think he would say that the difference shouldn't be at the level of the standards that it is held to, right? This is something that he really emphasizes, because he thinks, well, this notion that, a people's worldview amounts to a philosophy, he says, this is actually an expression of contempt towards Africans. It's to say, look, this worldview is good enough for you. You don't need the rigorous stuff. I mean, why would you? You should just, make do with what you have. So I think that kind of difference he would be hostile to. And the other thing too, of course, is that, the problem with overemphasizing originality is that, of course, it might lead you to reinvent the wheel, right? If all you really care about is being original, then maybe you overlook certain things that would be important or useful for your own project just because you want to differentiate yourself from this other discourse. But of course, I think we should, distinguish between an overemphasis on originality, which we should, I think, reject, and servility, right? I mean, there is no reason to think that, well, African philosophy has to follow the contours of European philosophy, because, for example, I think the way African philosophers think about the relationship between philosophy and its social context is far more interesting than what most European philosophers say about this stuff. So I think there shouldn't be any concession, I think, on that point. I mean, there were other questions too. On the question of social form, I think for Hassan, he would just think about it in terms of, a social formation or social structures, basically. I don't really think he has a specific idea of social form in mind, but I could be wrong on this. I'm not a Hassan scholar. I think this is a good question, but that's all I can say on that.
Great. I think we have Alex. Go ahead and unmute yourself, and then it doesn't look like there are other questions online, so if other people have questions here, don't hesitate to raise your hands. But Alex, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciated your critique of ethnophilosophy, but I was wondering if there's a sort of positive aspect to critique It seems like if we just sort of like abandon the project totally of like figuring out anthropological philosophy that can like uncover ancient African thinking, uncover ancient Native American thinking or whatever, then we're leaving a lot on the table. So I was wondering, is there a way to do that that doesn't fall into like the idealist abstractions of Pan-African philosophy that can then be exploited by petit bourgeois? Essentially, is there any way to do ethnophilosophy correctly, I guess?
Yeah, so are we taking a group of questions?
If you want to go ahead and respond, then feel free, and then we'll do a round in here. That's fine.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's a really good question, because I think it's not that one should reject the pursuit of ethnophilosophy understood as the sense of, well, actually, of course, there are, different ways in which we use the word philosophy. So we use it also to just talk about a worldview. We use it in English that way, right? It's fine. So that's why you can see, for example, football coaches talking about their philosophy as well, right? We understand that usage. It's not, we're not going to restrict usage by fiat. But I think it's important to be clear that, so for example, when I'm transmitting certain claims about what a certain group of people in that society believe to be true, I have to take into consideration that there is a differentiation in this society. And I'll give you a really concrete example. So in response to the critique of ethnophilosophy, they developed a program associated with the Kenyan philosopher Henry Odera Oruka called Sage Philosophy, where he says, look, it's right that we shouldn't really just go and think that we can discover these collectively held philosophies, but let's go talk to people in particular communities who are deemed by their community to be, wise people, and see what they make of certain questions and how they pose them, how they answer them. And that way we go beyond the myth of unanimity that Hontonji was so critical of. So I think that approach is very promising. And what's interesting, in that case is that Oruka, he interviews his own father, and he asks him, well, we grew up with these, certain religious beliefs and so on. What do you make of that? And then his father tells him, I think that my people are deeply confused about these religious questions. And I think that's really important, because you have to understand, of course, that in any community, there will be the hegemonic dominant view, and then there will be dissenters. And I think one key issue, of course, is if you have a community where literacy is not widespread, then the dissenting opinions often get lost or are much more difficult to retrieve. Just because if they are not communicated to someone, they would be lost. And you have lots of examples of this. So I think we can do it, of course, but we have to be more nuanced in the way we do it, I'd say.
I wanted to just add a question, because you said, you said earlier that you talked about decolonial theory sort of universalizing this ethnophilosophical approach, and you've also talked about that in your discussion of Cedric Robinson's work, which is also a touchstone for some decolonial theorists like Ramon Grossfogel, who have been branded themselves as decolonial Marxists, which seems like a real contradiction in terms to me. So I just wanted to ask you, especially since you have this really excellent article forthcoming, if you could talk a bit about what you mean about this sort of universalization of ethnophilosophy, which I think we see in decolonial theory and Afro-pessimism and the kind of racial capitalism framework. If you could just elaborate on that.
Right. Yeah. So maybe it's again best to pick, I think, concrete examples and then develop an account based on that. So, Cedric Robinson, one of the things he wants to do, right, and he says this pretty explicitly, he says actually Hegel, Marx, Darwin, Spencer all essentially express the same philosophical orientation. He doesn't really tell us what that philosophical orientation is, but there is this idea that there is just something that you could refer to as Western or European philosophy, and that all four of these very different thinkers express it. I think this is, again, this overemphasis on unanimity, on agreement. And I think why do I keep returning to this is because if we take, of course, a historical materialist account seriously, and a historical materialist account that takes seriously the notion that being determines consciousness. And if we put that in combination with the claim that you have these class stratified societies, you would say that, well, actually, you would expect that people occupying different positions or representing different classes would come up with radically different views. And so I think, this emphasis on unanimity is very problematic, and you see it very clearly in Robinson. And also, conversely, when he talks about what he takes to be distinctive about Black Marxism, he says it's rooted, and here I'm quoting, so it's rooted in a world consciousness. It stems from a world consciousness rooted in our African past. Again, which African past? And why is this important? Because if you're talking about the kind of high culture of the Malayan Empire, that's a totally different kind of political and philosophical discourse from maybe political discourse in less stratified African societies, right? So there is, I think, a deep kind of confusion going on that's not really helpful for making progress on these issues, because of course it is very interesting to ask, for example, to what extent, and because Gabriel started with this, maybe I'll circle back to it, to what extent, for example, certain beliefs were carried over to places like Haiti, and to what example, for example, they conditioned the response to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and so on. These are very interesting intellectual questions, but we don't really make progress on them by talking about, a general consciousness that all Africans share or something like that. It doesn't seem very fruitful to me. So to that extent, just at a methodological level, I would be really wary of these approaches. And the same thing, it doesn't, and then the other thing is also to circle back to the decolonial stuff. Sometimes when I read some of this material, it seems that they almost want to say that what explains colonialism is not, for example, the functional requirements of capitalism. No, it's actually some kind of Cartesian approach that seeks to dominate the world. And I think this is where we're totally separate, again, from any kind of serious historical materialist explanation. Now we're just talking about, philosophical views as driving history and so on. We're circling back to a kind of left Hegelianism. So I could say more, but maybe I'll leave more room for questions. If there is.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have some other questions.
Thank you again for this really interesting conversation. I wanted to ask, one of the things you cited or gave as an example is kind of the benefits or positive aspects of science and these certain theories of nature is about effectiveness, right? Ability to, it's undeniable once you see our mastery of naval technology or whatever, this sort of question where this theory of action is assessed in terms of effectiveness or in terms of the ability to practice or the success of practice. And it seems to me, and this is not an original idea, right, that this takes for granted a kind of instrumental rationality, right, where we have interests and we want to actualize those interests, and what's the best way to make those interests manifest. And whether or not you want to call that instrumental rationality Western or European, I'm not really interested in that question. But it seems like it's not a necessary form of consciousness. And so privileging science because it addresses this kind of instrumental rationality concern, I'm just curious what, if somebody takes issue with that, how might you address that?
Can I use yours? Hi. Thank you so much for this talk, and this reading this was really interesting, this alternate view of the role of colonialism in science and Western science larger. So my question is, as I was reading this, I was thinking a lot about like Thomas Kuhn's notion of scientific paradigms, and it's something that I think about a lot in terms of like revolution, especially as we're seeing the importance now of the education, not only in lands that are traditionally colonized, but also in lands of the colonizer. And I'm from the United States. A big thing that we're seeing right now, especially under the Trump administration, is a lack of funding for educational sources and just this sort of trying to do what they've done traditionally to the colonized peoples, and that just maintain the populace and the worker as uneducated as possible. So I guess I was just wondering if you had any like thoughts on your analysis what the role of scientific revolutions is in the revolution against the colonized more broadly. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I have two brief questions, but I can sort of conglomerate them into one. I come from a background of astrophysics, and in astrophysics there's a lot of discourse currently on the sort of coloniality of the astrophysics of the gaze in relation to observational astronomy, so the creation of telescopes and infrastructure in sites that are considered sacred by indigenous populations. A good example of this is Chile, or the Very Large Array in New Mexico. And I'm thinking here in terms of the left Hegelianism that you referred to in the context of decolonial theory. It seems to me that this is not a matter mutually exclusive with historical materialism. In the same way that being determines consciousness, being determines the way in which one comes to navigate their world, the gaze with which they gaze at the world around them. And in the same way that the sort of capitalist principle leads one to see a land that is not destitute of life as a mere sort of no man's land where resources are meant to be expropriated, or a people that are meant to be dominated for the sort of exploitation of their labor. In a similar way, the gaze of the scientist is to a certain extent synonymous with the colonial gaze, insofar as it is always already a capitalist, led by a capitalist principle. So I wonder how you reconcile this with your understanding of the sort of coloniality in science as a discourse of defeat.
Thank you so much for this incredible talk. I'm really excited to read the rest of the book. I was wondering, first, a little bit of a clarifying question, how to separate the sage as a figure in sage philosophy from the organic intellectual, and how to think through both of those. And second, kind of a methodological question of how philosophy can engage with the content of subordinated worldviews, Weltanschauungen, in such a way as to gain critical distance, perspective on the assumed norms of the philosopher, because I think following Millie's question, the ways in which the position as a producer of academic knowledge shapes one's worldview, inframes one's capacity to understand the world, and the ways in which one can critically engage with subordinated, non-hegemonic, however we want to frame it, Weltanschauungen to produce a more critical account. And I think we're seeing that with some pretty effective, like indigenous Marxisms, which pay attention to the ways in which, capitalism frames the world in such a way that it's impossible to even grasp it otherwise. Thank you so much.
This is kind of a related question, actually, to that one, to both of them. I was just wondering if you could speak a little on the place of ethics in relation to science and the ways that some of these like discourses of the multiplicity of sciences and epistemologies and their differences are rooted in their different approaches to the nexus between science and ethics itself, and the fact that there are some arguments that like Western science hasn't been as concerned with ethical considerations as other sorts of sciences have been, especially indigenous sciences, and more like specifically in culturally located sciences. And I guess like this kind of feeds into some of the larger questions about culturalism and stuff. So yeah.
So these are great questions. So I'll try maybe to develop like a general answer, because I think they're closely related. I think on the question of the gaze of the scientist, it's tricky, because I think, the historical record is worth studying on this, because, so for example, some of the earliest, we could say even environmentalists were Newtonians from the 18th century, who were studying actually the effects of European colonization on some of the islands that they were visiting and so on, and they thought that there was, a clear environmental degradation, right? So to that extent, it's a tricky issue, because even you can connect this to the question of instrumentality, which was posed in the beginning, and is this uniquely Western or perhaps uniquely capitalist? It's tricky because, of course, you could say, look, even from, when I tell you that the way you're harvesting fish or something like that is out of balance or something like that, I'm telling you that the rate is not sustainable. I'm telling you that what you're doing is irrational in instrumental terms, right? For our community to survive, and given what we know about the reproductive rate of this kind of fish, you cannot fish this way. So I think, kind of setting bounds and so on, that's possible within an instrumentalist approach. I don't think there is anything about the instrumentalist approach per se that would preclude that. So that's why I'm a bit careful about this question of whether the gaze is intrinsically colonial. Often it is colonial, but I wouldn't say it's intrinsically colonial. And the other example would be, and this is something that, I can talk a bit in detail about, because one of the things I've worked on quite a bit is the history of race science in the 19th century and various approaches. And it's true that, of course, there was a lot of ideological in the pejorative sense, right? In the Marx uses this in the pejorative way and so on. There was a lot of ideological scientific claims in race science about cranial capacity, all of that stuff. But interestingly, there were also some physicians who thought that these claims were not justified, even if they didn't draw political conclusions from them or something, right? But there is a kind of also professional integrity that if I'm serious about what I'm doing, I also, at some point, I can say this is really unserious work. So I think that the overall picture is quite complicated, and I think we don't really still have a sophisticated enough account of science in its social context to understand how, and this circles back, I think, to Jennifer's question about the social determination of knowledge claims and epistemic activity in general. I think we still don't really have a theory that explains this level of complexity that we see. And on the question of ethics, again, I think, there are modern scientists who think as scientists that they have to take certain ethical stances. You can think about, for instance, sorry, I'm trying to remember the particular case I'm interested in. But you could think of, for example, people who came to a kind of historical materialist or Marxist orientation while initially having been scientists. So Haldan would be, I think, a great example of this, where he thinks really seriously about the social responsibility of scientists and so on. And you have, for example, in the 1960s, there was an attempt to link science to questions of social and ethical responsibility, and this was a kind of pan-European endeavor. There is really good work on this by I forgot his last name, but his first name is Gerardo Eena, I think. He has some really interesting work on that. So that's why, again, I would be really hesitant to say that this is something characteristic of Western science. And the other thing is, we shouldn't ever forget that if you're talking about at least some indigenous or endogenous intellectual discourse, that in many cases, if we're talking about, for example, societies where you had very clear social stratification, there was an attempt to also mystify social reality to the subordinated classes in these societies. So that's why it's very dangerous for us to just say, these are, indigenous claims to knowledge, we should just protect them. I think the correct attitude, which is, the boring solution, is to critically interrogate these claims. If they're justified, that's fantastic. If they're unjustified, proceed accordingly. So I think that answers some of these questions.
Can we take another question, the last one online?
Yeah, time permitting, maybe we'll
Just take maybe.
we'll just take maybe one final question,
Okay.
just because we want time for a pause. But Michelle, I saw you had your hand up, so go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also thinking about Kuhn during this talk, and about how capital S science acquires a sort of authority as far as knowledge production, which has an implication for political decision making and all these things. So my question is kind of more elementary, I suppose. I guess what is the kind of science that historical materialism is? Right, there are debates about what counts as science. Is it what makes something science? Is it falsifiability? Is it observability, hypothesis testing? And that physics is a different type of science than natural science or math, and then issues around how sort of trying to understand the social world in the same way that we understand the natural world can be problematic. So I guess just very basically, what kind of science are we talking about when we're talking about historical materialism?
That's a huge question, Michelle. You want me to solve all the problems of philosophy of science, and if I had good answers to these questions, I'd be famous. So no, but I mean, okay, I won't try to answer this, but maybe kind of motivate some of these concerns. It's interesting, of course. So falsifiability, this is associated with Karl Popper, and Karl Popper has this view that, well, what marks out science from pseudoscience or non-science is that scientific claims are falsifiable. And it's interesting, of course, for the purposes of this workshop, that Popper was explicitly targeting historical materialism. And he's explicit about this. So he's writing in this, Viennese context, where actually in Vienna, Marxism was a very powerful cultural force and even a political force, and so actually there is a political debate there, and his claim is that Marxism doesn't really make falsifiable claims because you get this kind of ad hoc adjustment where people say, well, the reason that the socialist revolution didn't happen in advanced industrial societies is X, and they kind of build in these ad hoc assumptions. And it's interesting, of course, that out of all the kind of, so if you take a philosophy of science course, you'll be introduced to Popper, Kuhn, and maybe you'll also be introduced to somebody like Feyerabend or something like that, and these are three big figures, of course, in the in philosophy of science in the 20th century. But what's really interesting is that for some reason Popper has had a really important influence on scientists. So sometimes you'll even read physicists who speak in Popperian terms. So if you read some of these debates about string theory, some people will say, well, this stuff is not even falsifiable. These people are not doing science. So actually, the Popperian stuff has come to be taken up by some scientists. I mean, Kuhn is interesting, of course, because Kuhn himself is thinking about the fact that actually, if Popper was serious about falsifiability, it would be the case that a lot of what we take to be paradigmatic developments in science wouldn't amount to science properly so-called in the Popperian sense, because what Kuhn discovers is actually scientists are very tenacious in the face of counter evidence. They will try to account for anomalies as best as they can and so on. But of course, I think Kuhn, and I think this is where I would distance myself from the Kuhnian approach, is the part where he starts talking about incommensurability between different paradigms, that you cannot compare them. Therefore, you cannot measure superiority or inferiority because they operate with different basic concepts. They appeal to different criteria of evaluation. So I mean, obviously, I don't have a good answer to the demarcation problem. You figured this out by now. But I think, there is a very, interesting Hegelian Marxist strand in the work of somebody who responds to both Kuhn and Popper, which is Lakatosh. I think this would be someone who would be worth. Emre Lakatosh would be somebody whose work I think deserves more attention. Anyway, I don't think I have anything more interesting to say about this.
No, that was
very good
wonderful.
question.
Thank you so much, Zeyad. Thank you very much.